Thank you everyone for coming along today. So we've got a packed programme today, so without further ado, just some brief introductions. My name is David Myers, Director at Squire's Head of Power Planning team, joined by Alex Watts, who is Associate at Fisher German and a specialist in, among other things, natural capital, and joined by Rob Stoneman, who is a Director of Landscape Recovery at the Royal Society of the Wildlife Trust. Anyway, we've got some great speakers, and also I think one of the main things actually is just getting us all together, because I think in terms of biodiversity net gain topic, it is I suppose it's a new area, and there aren't many forums for us all to get together and talk about it. So I think that is very, very important. So as I say, the focus today is biodiversity net gain. I'm going to start off by setting the scene on biodiversity net gain and the regulations and some of the important points that I am picking up at the moment. Alex will provide more of a commercial view on things like the credit prices, unit prices, and the disposal of units. And then Rob will talk about some of the great work that the Wildlife Trust has been doing. We'll then have question and answers at the end, well, hopefully some answers, I'm not sure, because biodiversity again at the moment it's so early days, but we'll do our best. And then there'll be some drinks and nibbles at the end if you'd like to carry on networking at the end. So, first of all, and I appreciate, it's always a bit difficult in these things as to know what knowledge base everyone has on biodiversity. I appreciate there'll be different levels of experience here, so apologies to those who obviously know all of this. But what I'm going to do is go through as quickly as possible some of the basic points on biodiversity net gain, instead to essentially set the scene, and then I will just go on to some more detailed points. So first of all, what is biodiversity net gain? So it is a way to contribute to the recovery of nature while developing land, is making sure the habitat for wildlife is in a better state than it was before development. Essentially, one takes the value of the habitat on site pre-development and then understands the value post-development, i.e. there has to be a net gain post-development. That is the basic principle. So biodiversity net gain has actually been with us for a good while, actually, a number of years in national policy. Just shown on the slide there, just a brief reference to it in the National Planning Policy Framework. But there hasn't been a uniform approach. It's essentially filtered down to local planning authorities in various different ways. No real uniform approach. However, what we now have through the Environment Act is a requirement for a biodiversity net gain on a statutory footing. So it will no longer just be a policy requirement, it will be a legislative requirement. And that requirement is to provide at least a 10% biodiversity net gain on development sites going forward. Now, there are some exceptions, but which I'll go on to explain. This mandatory requirement applies to planning applications made on or after the 12th of Feb. Again, there are some exceptions. It doesn't apply to everything, which I'll talk about, but the main point is that it is with us, the 12th of Feb being the key date. So plan applications made on or after that date. So what we have, so in November of last year, we essentially had a whole raft of guidance and draft regulations that were published. It was essentially just a complete knowledge dump for us all to try and wade our way through. That guidance has not really developed too much, but what I would say is that the key piece of guidance for any developer here is the planning practice guidance. That gives a lot of detail on how one approaches biodiversity net gain in a development context in terms of submitting a planning application and how it's dealt with. I'll just describe some of those elements now. So the first thing for a developer is that there are new validation requirements in a plan application. So the plan application form will have changed slightly. So there will be a need for a statement as to whether biodiversity net gain applies. You've got to specify that because it will not apply in every scenario. You've got to confirm whether there has been any degradation since January 2020. What I mean by degradation is whether there's been any lowering of habitat since that date, in which case you need to readjust your date for calculating biodiversity. And you have to then provide your pre-development biodiversity value, and that is by using a metric tool. So there's a statutory metric that has been created which will measure the biodiversity on site, and obviously then provide a plan showing the biodiversity. That in essence is the validation requirements. However, there can be local level requirements by different local authorities. So, for example, I already know that there are certain local authorities that are requiring you to provide post-development calculations at day one, so when you submit the application. And that's even in the context of outline applications where you still have to provide an indicative value of what you think the post-biodiversity net gain value would be on site. In terms then of how biodiversity is dealt with in the planning application process, now it says here on the slide that it's a post-permission matter. That is what is made clear in the guidance. However, what's also made clear in the guidance is that biodiversity net gain will be a material consideration in the application process. You still have to show how you are going to achieve that at least 10% requirement in the application process. Now, the reason why I say it's a post-permission matter is that yes, you have to show that, but that isn't actually crystallised and confirmed, the 10%, until you discharge a pre-commencement planning condition. So just shown here on the slide what the wording is. So development may not be begun unless a biodiversity gain plan has been submitted to the LPA and approved by the LPA. So what that means is that you have to submit a biodiversity gain plan. It has to be submitted at least no earlier than a day after the grant of planning permission. This biodiversity gain plan which confirms accurately how you will provide that at least 10% requirement. And that will confirm, for example, if you're providing it on site, if you're acquiring units and statutory credits, which is something that Alex will explain a bit more about. Now, there is a draft template for the biodiversity gain plan. The guidance makes it very clear that you should use that draft template. It is very user-friendly. There is a lot of guidance on it, but essentially, I would certainly advise that is used. In terms of delivery. So essentially 3 mechanisms that are referenced in guidance and statute. There's the on-site delivery, which is clearly the priority. There is a B&G hierarchy, biodiversity gain hierarchy, which makes it absolutely clear that one should look at on-site delivery and how that is provided, and how the habitat is not impacted, or if it is impacted, how it will be mitigated and avoided, etc. So there's a clear hierarchy that on-site delivery is the priority. However, there will be scenarios where it cannot be delivered on site. In such a scenario, then we look at off-site delivery. And when I talk about off-site delivery, what I mean is that either the developer owns an off-site area of land where they can provide habitat and essentially allocate habitat units to your site, which would then increase it to the necessary 10%, or they are relying on third parties who will provide habitat and essentially allocate those units to your site, but you would have to purchase those units, so essentially providing a habitat bank, which would then serve your site. Now, I won't go into too much depth on that because I know that Alex will touch more on that. But the one clear thing is that in terms of relying on these off-site area of land, in any such case, that land has to have been registered. So that land has to be registered with Natural England. There is, in theory, a relatively quick process as to how that would work. It should be a 6 weeks process. A limited fee, I think it's about £630 to register that off-site area of land, but the key thing is that land has to have been registered. So in terms of timing, if you are relying on any off-site area of land, you know that it has to have been registered before you can discharge your pre-commencement condition. So there's always that timing perspective as a developer. And then the final one is statutory credits, which are ridiculously priced, incredibly uncompetitive. They are meant to be a last resort. It is made absolutely clear that one should only be relying on these statutory credits as a last resort. And I'm hoping, given the audience here, and I know there's a number of habitat bank providers in the audience, that they will be able to meet the demand so that we do not need to rely on statutory credits going forward. So, securing enhancements. This is vital. This is where the lawyers would come in. So basically, the biodiversity net gain has to be secured, and there's two different models for whether it's on-site or off-site. So on-site biodiversity can be secured either through a planning condition, Section 106 agreement, or conservation covenant. I'll go on to discuss conservation covenants in a bit. Hopefully, you're all fair with Section 106 agreements to some extent, essentially planning agreements with the local planning authority. Importantly, any developer, I'm sure sitting here in the audience, would always go for a planning condition because there is far greater flexibility in terms of future variation. But it's made also clear that we cannot use a planning condition where there is any funding for actually delivering the biodiversity net gain. So any monitoring fees, for example, that would be payable to the local planning authority. In such a scenario, you would need a Section 106 or conservation covenant. So there will always be that planning agreement element, I expect. The on-site provision must be secured for at least 30 years from the date the development is complete. Now, the reason why completion is so important is because we're not talking about completion where the last house or the final industrial unit has been finished. It is the point where everything is finished. The POS, the biodiversity net gain, everything has been completed. Then the 30-year clock would start. So you can see how that could be a significant period of time. Off-site delivery, so that can only be secured by either a Section 106 agreement or conservation covenant, so no planning conditions for off-site delivery. In that scenario, the 30-year period would run from the point that the habitat has been finished. When I talk about finished in that scenario, it's not the point where the habitat reaches fruition, because obviously that could be 10, 15 years later, depending on the type of habitat. It's the point essentially where the initial planting has taken place. That is the point that when the 30 years would then commence. So exemptions, there are a number of exemptions for the developer going forward. So permitted development, so that is for the small scale development, it is permitted under the permitted development order. So things like small extensions on residential, certain changes of uses, etc. So essentially smallish development where B&G wouldn't apply. Irreplaceable habitats, so that's particular types of habitat which has their own policy protection. If you do actually enhance irreplaceable habitats, then that could still count towards your B&G score. But ultimately, if you were to try taking away irreplaceable habitats, that would be a separate arrangement. Low existing biodiversity value sites is an important one, because that is what's called the de minimis, the small threshold, essentially, where if low priority or non-priority habitat of less than 25 square metres, or linear habitats, so like hedgerows of 5 metres, is only affected, then you wouldn't have to provide a 10% requirement. So, for example, if you deal with a fully tarmac site, then you wouldn't have to provide 10% because there wouldn't be any biodiversity. But equally, if your red line plan includes a whole host of biodiversity, but your actual development is only impacting a very, very small amount of biodiversity, again, that exemption should be capable of applying. Household applications, so again, that's the small residential applications. Biodiversity gain sites, so that's the habitat banks. Essentially, they're providing a full B&G, so they don't provide 10% on top of what they're already providing. Small scale self-build, so that's for 9 self-build houses or less on, I think it's half a hectare of land. high-speed rail development, so small development. So this is, when I mentioned at the start that it applies to the majority of plan applications. So for those plan applications of 9 dwellings or less on a hectare of land, or where it's outline residential for half a hectare, or on, I think it's 1,000 square metres of non-resi on a hectare, the 10% requirement doesn't apply until the 2nd of April. So any applications made from the 2nd of April onwards, BNG will apply. So that's obviously only a few weeks away. And then national significant infrastructure projects. So these are the large infrastructure, large road schemes, energy schemes. It won't apply until late November 2025, which seems a long way away. But for these types of projects, they're already in their development stage now. And there's already some interesting discussions about whether these types of companies or entities that would rely on, that would create these types of schemes, could rely on their CPO powers for biodiversity net gain. I don't think they can, or certainly that's the suggestion at the moment. It will be a topic of debate going forward as to whether one could rely on those powers. So that was just a very, very quick run through. I appreciate there's a heck of a lot more on biodiversity net gain. So what I want to do, rather than just give a general comments, I want to focus on some of the points that I'm seeing at the moment in the market. First of all, it is made absolutely clear that biodiversity net gain will be considered throughout the planning process. So that is starting at the pre-app stage. And pre-apps are going to be so important for developers because a number of local authorities have made it absolutely clear that they will not speak to applicants if you do not submit a pre-app, unfortunately, which is a bit of a strange scenario. But if you don't go down the pre-app route, you could be in trouble. But it's made clear in the guidance that you should submit details of B&G at the pre-app stage so that the local authority can comment on it, so you can get some comments at that stage. Role of ecologists. So I keep on saying to my daughter that she should become an ecologist because there is going to be a lot of need for good quality ecologists. And the reason why I say a good quality ecologist is because the difference that those ecologists can make, if they make a mistake in denoting particular habitat, it can have a massive financial effect for the developer going forward. And therefore you need those good quality ecologists, and unfortunately I don't think there's enough of them out there to meet demand. A draft biodiversity net gain plan, I'm of the view that yes, you can only discharge the biodiversity net gain condition after the grant of planning permission, but you should be able to submit a draft plan during the application to get the local authorities' comments, and then that should smooth the process for actually discharging the planning condition. Next point, in terms of care over timing, the reason why I say that is that from a developer's perspective, if you are acquiring units, acquiring statutory credits, that could be a big financial commitment. You need to be sure that you have discharged all your other pre-commencement conditions and that the scheme is viable in order to actually then think about discharging that B&G condition in reality. If there is any doubts about viability, you've got to be absolutely sure on viability, because otherwise you're committing yourself to a big expense and then not being able to progress with your development. So you've got to be very careful in terms of timing. In terms of care over impact on habitat, now this is quite an interesting one. I'm seeing this a lot. I was just speaking about this a few minutes ago. I am noticing that developers more and more now are being very, very careful about the habitat, which is great from a conservation perspective. But they are recognising, particularly on brownfield sites, that there is this there can be very high distinctive habitats in there, which can be very, very costly to try and mitigate, try and replace. So therefore, they are looking at trying to avoid that impact and trying to retain particular habitats rather than essentially trying to replace it because of that cost implication. So I think that is certainly an interesting approach now from developers. Red line boundary, I think, is important from two perspectives. One, if you're a developer, if you don't need to include certain habitats in your red line, then don't, because otherwise that is just going to potentially increase your baseline. But equally from a habitat bank provider's perspective, and I've seen this already, that when preparing your plans, your habitat management monitoring plans, have a look at the title. Make sure it matches up to what you actually own. Because I've already seen that actually by linking it in with what you own, you actually have more habitat than what, or more land to create habitat than what you think. And therefore the actual units that can be created are more than what you think. But equally on the contrary, if you're agreeing to provide habitat on an area of land that you don't own, then obviously that's going to be a problem. So make sure that there is that it does match up. The next point is benefits of conservation covenants. And this is something that I'm trying to push to a number of people. I do think conservation covenants can be a viable alternative to Section 106 agreements. I think that they can be a way forward instead of Section 106 agreements, and there's actually a good bit of positivity there. Now, the reason why we haven't seen any conservation covenants is that we need, basically it's an agreement between a responsible body and a landowner. And a responsible body is either a local authority, could be a conservation charity, conservation body whose purpose is primarily conservation, but they have to have been registered with Natural England. And the process of registration should have taken 12 weeks. It actually started, it was in July of last year when the first applications could be made. However, as of only a few weeks ago, we didn't have any responsible bodies because the process hadn't gone through. We now have started to see, so I think the first one was RSK Biocensus. I've also heard through the grapevine that another couple may have been approved as of yesterday. I'm waiting for some more names. The website still only shows Natural England, but my understanding is that RSK have been approved. I think I did some LinkedIn posts on it. But I know that there's a number of, for example, wildlife trusts and other bodies that have submitted and were waiting for a response. They had met with delays from Natural England for various reasons, and perhaps a lack of dialogue, but obviously it's a very new process. But I'm hoping that now there's going to be a bit of a domino effect and we'll start to get more responsible bodies through the door. The reason why I think it's beneficial is that for responsible bodies perspective, and I'm speaking here to people from the Wildlife Trust or for any conservation charity that may be interested in it, I think that it is an opportunity for them to take the lead in providing and monitoring and dictating how habitat can be delivered. Yes, there are certain concerns about making sure it will be delivered, but we can sort that out in terms of how the drafting is dealt with in any conservation covenant. I do feel that it is an opportunity for them to take things forward. Secondly, and perhaps one of the key things, is that local plan authorities are, we all know, stretched. I mean, obviously I'm giving this presentation in Birmingham. We know what's happening in Birmingham at the moment. They're very stretched financially. That is not that is not an unusual scenario. There are a lot of local authorities that are stretched financially. Planning teams are stretched. Ecologist teams are stretched. Some don't even have ecologists. The reality is that I do have concerns that they're going to meet the demand. I mean, only in a couple of weeks we're going to have small scale applications that require the 10% B&G. At the moment, obviously, it's just the major applications, but they're going to be inundated. Local authorities still don't have concrete drafts in place. They don't have the necessary support in there to help them going forward. So I think local authorities will rely on responsible bodies coming forward. I think they'll be more than happy to deal with them in partnership. Because ultimately a conservation covenant does not need to include a local authority. It is a way, essentially, of bypassing going through the local authority. The types of agreement also can represent a far more flexible approach. I do feel that there is a possibility of a uniform covenant being created, which is hopefully something that I'll be able to involve in and prepare going forward. Yes, there will be project-specific requirements that the responsible body would always want to see, but ultimately I do think that we can create this uniform precedent which we just won't see with local planning authorities, because we all know in terms of how they draft planning agreements that they are just so mixed. There is no clear uniformity there. next point, it's linked to what I've just been saying, but the only other point I would say is because I've spoke only a few weeks ago with a head of planning at an authority which I won't name, but he was essentially banging his head against a brick wall because he was trying to explain to different members within the council the benefits of B&G, but they just weren't seeing it, and therefore we're not looking at their own land bank. So for those in the audience that are looking at habitat banks, please speak with your local authority, because I have a feeling that they will be more than happy to work in partnership with people that want to take those types of land banks forward. And a final point before I pass over to Alex is that I'm very positive about biodiversity net gain. It's something I'm quite passionate about. I do think there are lots of opportunities going forward and lots of considerations that need to be had. I mean, working with the Wildlife Trust, I've had the pleasure of being able to do that. I can see the great schemes that they're putting forward. But equally, habitat bank providers, being able to work with them. And again, yes, there's a monetary side of things, but ultimately you've got to see what they're achieving, which is the creation of more and more habitat, which is obviously great for the environment. So on that note, I will pass you over to Alex.
Hello, thank you firstly to David for inviting me to come and speak to you all today. As David said, there's a range of people in the audience, so I'm slightly concerned I might be teaching some of you to suck eggs, but it's quite challenging with a presentation like this to judge the knowledge in the room, so I will provide a bit of a whistle-stop tour as to what B&G is and that sort of thing, and then get into the nitty-gritty of some interesting information. So a bit about me. I'm a chartered surveyor qualified in the rural pathway. Been looking at biodiversity net gain for about the last 3 years now. Principally from a landowner's perspective, at Fisher German we have decided to remain unbiased in terms of the models that are out there, which allows us to provide some good consultancy advice to landowners, but also to developers as they are seeking units and trying to get their heads around the requirements. So without further ado, biodiversity net gain overview. So David has covered most of this stuff quite eloquently, but it's now mandatory from February. However, despite the fact that it's mandatory from February, there are a lot of developments which were captured before this mandatory date. I think one of the points to make is there is an unavoidable requirement of planning. You will not be able to argue on grounds of viability or feasibility like you can, for example, with affordable housing. It cannot be argued out. Measured in terms of habitat units, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of now. We've seen this become a real buzzword recently. I think the table on the slide that hopefully you can all see is quite a good breakdown of how it's looked at in terms of the numbers. So if you've got a development site which is worth 100 biodiversity units prior to any development taking place, you work out what 10% added to that is. I work with easy numbers, I'm not very good at maths, so hence why I've used 100. You then map your scheme on top of that and work out the impact that scheme is going to have on that habitat that's there already. And that will allow you to ascertain what can be delivered on site and what your ultimate loss is when trying to achieve that 10% net gain. And from that point of view, you can then explore the opportunity of what can be done on site versus off site. So the metric, I am not an ecologist, so please don't start asking me technical questions about how the metric works, because I don't know. But I felt it was prudent to note what it is, because obviously it is forms the basis of biodiversity net gain. We now have the statutory official biodiversity metric. We've seen various iterations of the metric prior to this point. Do I think it will stay the only one? Probably not, on the basis that we had a number before this point. Habitat value is determined based on the area of the habitat, its distinctiveness, so how rare it is in that area in terms of its type of habitat, the scarcity condition, and the significance to the wider habitat network. So the way I think about it is, if you have an area of land which is in close proximity to high value habitats, SSSI, national parks, that sort of thing, from a multiplier effect, it's going to be more advantageous because it helps link high value habitats. Local nature recovery strategies. These are strategies which every local planning authority currently has a responsibility to create. They will work like allocated housing land in a way. So lots of local authorities are already putting forward a call for sites, and that's where they're inviting landowners of any type and nature to bring forward land which can be utilised as these local nature recovery strategies. What that will mean is it will be more advantageous from the metric point of view because you will get a multiplier on the number of units that you're creating. What it will mean in terms of requirements to be registered as a local nature recovery strategy, we're not 100% sure yet. Waiting for a bit more clarity from the LPAs. I'm not 100% sure they know yet. There is not a standard figure of how many units per hectare. I get asked that all the time. It basically comes down to what the habitat is there at the moment, what condition it is, how rare it is. So there is no one size fits all. I will come on to habitat banks throughout this presentation, but one thing that we've seen looking at some sort of discounted cash flows for habitat banks, the more habitat units which can be generated per area obviously helps your profitability of that habitat bank because your sort of maintenance costs are worked out on a per hectare or acre basis. And obviously if you get more bang for your buck in terms of number of units per area, it's going to make that site more profitable from a habitat banking point of view. So as David touched on, the mitigation hierarchy, avoidance over compensation. So again, I think this is really important because we've seen some planning applications come really unstuck by this. It requires you to avoid habitat loss. Now, it's really easy to say, but if you've got a prime development site, you're very unlikely to not damage any habitat. On-site enhancement is really important. I think people think immediately when you talk about biodiversity net gain that you're only going to be creating new habitat, whereas actually it's more beneficial to enhance existing. So again, as David said, if you've got areas of high value habitat which can be avoided, but being lost, just avoid it and then you can enhance them. Otherwise it's going to be really costly for you to compensate. On-site creation is the preference, and then looking at off-site, we had a planning application that we were looking at for a client, delivery of around 2,000 homes. The land was allocated for housing, so everyone was in agreement that this land should come forward for housing. The client had fortunately some off-site land where they could deliver the off-site habitat, the offsetting. Submitted this into the council, and the council said, no, we don't want to see it off-site, we want to see it all on-site. And that meant that there was only 1,200 homes that could be delivered. So it's, that's the kind of thing that we're coming up against, and this is why the mitigation hierarchy is so important. Local policies, I think we don't really need to say that they are quite unclear, quite inconsistent. Each local authority is dealing with it slightly differently, which makes it really challenging. Statutory credits, as David said, they are a method of last resort. They are priced very high at $42,000 for a very basic credit, like a grassland credit, to up to $650,000 for I think they're lake units. But just in case they're inexpensive enough, it's not buy one get one free. It's buy one, you've got to buy two. So they are very expensive, but I think that's a good thing because ultimately we want this to be an open market. It needs to be transactional, and it can't be if everyone's just relying on government credits. Habitat offsetting. I won't talk about the legal agreements because David's covered that. Must be registered on the Net Gain Register. I think, as David said, the timing issue is a big one because to get it registered on the Net Gain Register, there's a lot that needs to be done prior to that point. You're going to have done your baseline. You need to have drafted a habitat management and monitoring plan. You need an agreed Section 106 with the local authority, which, as we know, is a bit challenging. So it's not a quick thing to just get it on the register. I think we've seen that on the basis that there's not that many on there already. Again, the 6 weeks determination might not feel like that much, but the time taken to get it to that point is inevitably going to be quite drawn out. Trading rules. Again, we've come across some clients that become really unstuck by this, so I think it's really important to note. Habitat has to be compensated on a like-for-like basis. You can't take out ancient woodland and just establish new grassland to compensate it. They won't allow that. The metric wants to have the same habitat or a better version of that habitat. And that's really important where you're looking at off-site habitat, because if you've got a certain type of calcareous grassland on-site, you can't just use any old grassland off-site to compensate it with. It has to be a better version of that habitat or the same. And I think that's a really important note. Spatial risk metric penalises offsetting outside the LPA area or the national character area. So it's either or. And again, in terms of offsetting, if you are destroying habitat here, it's only right that you try and compensate it as close as possible to the development site. So that's why that spatial risk multiplier does incentivise that within the metric. Habitat delivery in priority areas, I think the local nature recovery strategies is going to be really important for that, because it will allocate those areas that the local planning authority have said we want to see it here. I've touched on that already. Third-party offsets. If I had £1 for every time anyone asked me how much a habitat unit was worth, I would be so wealthy by now. I should have been just charging for it at the start, but it is a very common question with no simple and easy answer. 25k is where everyone lands, isn't it, at the moment? And it's generally what we're seeing with the higher values for the more distinct, rarer types of habitats, or the habitats which are slightly harder to create. If I'm honest, from speaking to landowners, there's going to be a lot of landowners that are going to be keen to establish grassland. They know about grassland, they already have it, they know how to use, how to manage it, how to establish it. Wetland, for example, it's probably not going to be so attractive. So, and I think that's where we'll see the price differentiation. Supply and demand, I think, will be really key. No surprise there. It's an open market. We're seeing a really good supply coming forward now with a lot of habitat bank providers. There's a lot of noise about a lot of units. Is there going to be too many? Is there not going to be enough? I don't know. I think with the mitigation hierarchy, there is a risk that in certain areas there will be too many. I don't know. I'm speculating, but I've been, in the last 3 weeks, had 4 separate emails from developers, and their demand for units has been less than 2. And no landowner is going to get out of bed for just... I had 0.36 of a unit is what they needed. I laughed at them and said I'd contact a habitat bank provider if I was you, because it's just not going to work. So and then they're going to want to charge a higher fee for... They're not going to charge on a... You're not going to get 25,000 a unit, and because you know the legal work, and it's the same for how many units you're providing. So again, how it's going to settle out, I don't know, but I think it's one to be aware of. So as I said, we've been advising a lot of landowners on the different development models of bringing habitat forward. There are a number out there. The first one, which we saw mostly in the early days, but we're actually seeing more of now, is bespoke agreements. This is where a developer has an understanding of exactly what they need. They've got a development, they know they need X number of X units, so 10 grassland units, moderate condition or whatever it is. This is quite a nice one to deal with because no one's really at risk at this point. An option can be entered into to deliver that habitat. The landowner knows that they're creating it for a known seller. They're not creating or spending money at risk. Usually legal fees are undertaken by the developer at that point, so it's a nice one to have, but obviously they're slightly harder to come by. The reason that bespoke agreements came about at the start is because ultimately, as David said, biodiversity net gain needs to be thought about right at the start of a planning application. And in the early days, local developers weren't thinking about it when they submitted their planning, because that was 3 years ago and it wasn't an issue. No one thought about biodiversity net gain, and then they got a pre-commencement condition saying they had to deal with it, and they hadn't designed their scheme taking it into account. So I think that's where that market came from. And then the issue with that is that you're taking a landowner who hasn't done a baseline, a habitat management monitoring plan, and the time it takes them to get to those oven-ready credits is quite protracted, and the developer might lose interest and go to someone who has those credits, who can basically help them discharge that condition a little bit quicker. So that's where we come to the habitat banking. So this is where a landowner establishes habitat in advance of demand to generate oven-ready credits. This can be done in a number of ways, and I'm going to talk through the process of doing that in a little bit more detail. Land lease. There's a famous land lease option in the audience, so I won't talk about this one too much, but basically this is where a landowner enters into a lease with a habitat bank provider. They pay them a rent. They might also pay them a management fee, dependent on whether the landowner wants to be responsible for that management, and they take on the responsibility of trading those units. Promotion agreement we're seeing come to fruition. That works much like the standard promotion agreement that we see in the development world, whereby a third party works with the landowner to promote the land for use of as a habitat bank, and then they share potential profits and costs. And then I can't even count. The fifth one, we're seeing freehold disposal, whether that's flat disposal based on an agreed uplifted value, or a freehold disposal based on agricultural land with an overage. Biodiversity overages, as you can probably imagine, are quite technical and hard to get your head around. I had a go at drafting on some heads of terms the other day, and it hurt my head. So they are quite challenging, and how they're actually going to work in practice, we don't really know, but we'll have a go at drafting them all the same. Habitat banking costs. I think there's a lot of thought that biodiversity net gain is going to be this gravy train for landowners, and it's going to be all money, and it's going to be this answer of RPA payments going away, and it's just going to be a massive income opportunity. And undoubtedly there will be value in selling units, but I think not enough is said about the costs that are potentially associated with creating a habitat bank. From the very start, as soon as you start involving professionals like legals, surveyors, ecology, they're expensive. And if you don't have that bespoke agreement, if you don't have that developer who knows how many units they want and have guaranteed to purchase them, you're doing this all at risk at the moment. So ecology costs, establishment work. So you're going to be responsible for setting up whatever habitat you've agreed to produce on that land. Legal and professional costs, site registration. It's not a big fee to register the site on the net gain register, admittedly, but it is still a fee. Land evaluation, I come on to that a little bit later, so I'm just going to skim over that for now, but I think it's a big consideration. And then the operational costs. Remember, this isn't that you might get this money up front, you might get £30,000 a unit up front, but someone's going to have to manage that for 30 years. And at year 15, when the money's gone, what happens? So ongoing management costs, ongoing monitoring and reporting. We're getting a better idea of the regularity of that from local authorities now, but what happens if it fails and that kind of thing is still, we're yet to get to that point. Costs of sales, ultimately there'll be platforms out there that will market your units, but you very well might need to pay them some fees as well. Insurance is a really interesting one. I think we are on the cusp of getting some insurance brokers, underwriters who will insure these things. But again, what will that cost? Because if I was creating a habitat bank, I think I'd want to insure it just in case, force majeure, that it floods. We've got a lot of flooding around at the moment. It's probably going to only get worse. What happens if the habitat gets flooded and everything gets destroyed at year 15? Who's responsible for that? Well, the landowner is. And administration costs. So there's a process there that we are seeing, but I think, not to be negative, but I think there are a lot of costs there that obviously need to be forecast. So to end, like David did, some key considerations that I think are quite pertinent. It is an additional planning burden, and you're not going to get away from it. So it really needs full consideration and right at scheme conceptualisation, as David said, so that you can best mitigate that habitat loss and try and maximise doing it on site. I think what we've seen is the massive, large-scale housing developments will not struggle to do it on site. They've got a massive red line boundary. They'll have sustainable drainage systems. They'll have green space allocations. They'll have lots of opportunity to deliver that net gain on site. Whether that's the best thing for nature is another argument, but they will have the opportunity to do it on site. I think the challenge is going to be with the more constrained, potentially commercial sites where there isn't any room. And if you want to deliver a viable development scheme, you are going to need to deliver your habitat somewhere else. LPAs are underprepared and resourced to manage implementation. Again, I'm not being too negative. I'm sorry that if there are any LPAs in the building, I don't envy their role in this, because I think they have been aware that this has been coming for a while, but I'm not sure they've necessarily got the tools in-house to properly deal with it. So it is challenging, and for the developers in the room, it's really challenging when every single one seems to be doing it differently and wanting different things. Potential delay in delivery of development / site disposal. So if you want to get outline consent and sell your site, if you haven't sorted your B&G, that is going to delay things. Another consideration. Potential reduced density of development to accommodate on-site habitat, as I mentioned in that example that I gave of that housing development where they wanted it all on-site. It's going to massively impact how many housing units are going to be delivered. Long-term liability of habitat management associated costs. Management of sites pre-development, I think, is also a really important point, because I think sometimes it's overlooked. And I suppose this point is also about where you've got land where you're looking to explore habitat banking. If you leave land to do what it likes, it might impact the habitat that is going to be established on that site. I used to think that if you just left it to establish, in all cases, it was really negative. But it is really dependent on what habitat you've got there. And what you're trying to do with that site. So it's not a one size fits all, but if you've got an area of grassland, for example, get your mower out and start mowing it if you're going to be developing it, or if you're not, do a baseline and then start doing things. So, it's just for those landowners that have strategic sites, they need to be actively managing them so they don't get done for degradation in due course. Just have an active plan for management. Pricing of unit supply versus demand. I slightly alluded to my scepticism in some areas of demand of units, particularly when there is a lot of options out there now. I really hope it doesn't become a race to the bottom, but I think in certain areas where there are, I saw 7,000 grassland units in one LPA area the other day, and I just thought, is there really going to be need for that many units in that little LPA when there's a lot of green space in that area? I don't know. So we'll have to see. But if you've done your discounted cash flow based on getting 25,000 a unit, and you're only then able to sell them for 10, and your management costs aren't going to change, and your monitoring costs aren't going to change, I think, obviously we can factor in some indexing there, but it just needs to be looked at. Open negotiations separate to one to cover B&G and options, sorry. Yeah, so this is where, as David was saying, your red line boundary drawing. Can you draw a separate red line boundary or a blue line boundary, as we've had them referred to, for taking out an option to create some off-site habitat on that wider land holding? It might not be needed, but at least you've got it if you need it. Overage negotiations on land sales, as I said, we've been looking at them. Again, they're quite tricky to try and word. Land valuations is what I'm going to end on. I'm not a valuer, but I have done quite a lot of work in valuation in the past, and I think it's going to have a really interesting impact on land values. We are already seeing evidence of your lower grade agricultural land increasing in value because of this hope for habitat banking. So I think it will be really interesting to see where the market goes on that. I think there will be a steady increase, and I think there'll be more landowners wanting things like overages and that sort of thing. At the opposite end of the scale, where you've produced that habitat bank, I don't think it can be ignored the impact that habitat bank is going to have on that freehold value. We know that the habitat is going to need to be established for a minimum of a 30-year term. We don't know what happens on expiry of that term. Do I really think that you'll be able to do what you like with it after that 30-year term expires? I think you've got to work on the basis that you will have some form of designated nature site. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know if you'll be able to sell further units on top of that. But I think as a landowner, you need to be aware that your 15 grand an acre arable land probably isn't going to be worth that in 30 years' time. But I don't know how much it will be worth, so please don't ask me that question. That's about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, David and Alex, for preceding me, because you're now all experts in the room, which means I don't have to do all the technical stuff, which is good. So I can be the light entertainment, or, well, it's B&G, so lighter entertainment, I think is probably the right word. Let me just explain so who the Wildlife Trusts are. So we're 46 Wildlife Trusts across the country, for those that don't know the Wildlife Trust, and a central charity called the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. So we're the sort of the tail that's wagged by the big dog of the Wildlife Trusts. And we also have the Wildlife Trust Consultancies. We have some in the room here today, which is great to see. So it's a pretty complicated organisation. And I want to just pick on three things that we do, which is relevant to biodiversity net gain. So one is we've managed nature reserves. So we've done that for a very long time, actually, over 100 years. We've got 2,500 nature reserves, which is, as my chief exec always says, is more than twice as many nature reserves as there are McDonald's restaurants. And they're definitely better for your waistline. So that means we've got a pool of people that do nothing else but nature restoration. That's what they do day in, day out. It's absolutely our bread and butter. We also have a whole series of land advisors. We've got about 280 full-time equivalents on land advice. So we're constantly out there giving land advice to farmers, mainly on habitats and species. And we also run, most wildlife trusts give a lot of advice to local planning authorities around developments. So we rarely object to developments. We're usually trying to work with developers to help those developments become more sustainable. But we will object, of course, if we see developments destroying precious habitats and so on. But that also means we have very strong relationships with local planning authorities. So most wildlife trusts are in and out of their local planning authorities. So that obviously all puts us in an interesting position when it comes to biodiversity net gain. David ended his talk saying, what's this all about? So I'm also going to give a little bit of context to biodiversity net gain, because I think it's important. We are signed up to the Convention of Biodiversity, Biological Diversity, which is one of the 1992 Rio conventions. So we had climate, forest, localism, which we've all forgotten about, and nature. And at the COP15, so the Convention of Parties 15 just last year, we had the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. And actually the UK was part of a high ambition group. So we went out to the international community and said, look, we've got to be really ambitious about nature. And we got into the text, the final text was agreed by all of those countries, 192 countries, I think, the 30 by 30 targets. So that's 30% of our degraded land, in the UK most of our land is degraded, being restored for nature. And 30% of that land also being protected for nature. They're more or less interchangeable in the UK, but that's a lot. And the Wildlife and Countryside Link, that's all of the NGOs in as an umbrella partnership, have estimated that in England we're at about 3.3%. That's a massive gap. DEFRA are a little bit more ambitious on their approach to this, and they're sort of saying about 8%. You can argue the toss. It doesn't really matter actually between 3 and 8%. We're miles off, and this is a 2030 target just 6 years ago. So we're really a very, very long way from that. Nevertheless, DEFRA has enormous ambition around the new environmental land management system and how that might impact on that. Ideas around improving the state of our national parks, which are pretty poor in comparison to most parks around the world. A new national forest has been proposed, 750 million in the Nature for Climate Fund for woodland planting and peatland restoration. Fantastic, great to see that. And even research into temperate rainforest, although £750,000 doesn't seem enough to make much of a difference on that. And the difference is huge. So this is the Dasgupta review, looking at the funding gap. And I like to put it in terms of football, because I'm a Leicester City fan, who would be. But the total turnover of British nature conservation, so all the statutory agencies, Wildlife Trust, RSPB, Forest England, so on, is less than the turnover of the two Manchester football clubs, which is pretty shocking. No wonder we live in one of the most depleted nations in terms of our biodiversity on this planet. So we have some of the worst diversity on this planet. So that funding gap is huge, somewhere between 13 billion to 15 billion over the next 10 years. And it's another part of the DEFRA ambition to create a private market in nature restoration worth £500 million per year by 2027, and £1 billion per year by 2030. That's very ambitious. We're quite a long way from that. And obviously the Environment Act is bringing in biodiversity net gain. We have things like the Habitats Directive that has developed the nutrient neutrality market and so on. These are part of that private mechanisms that are coming in. So we can see these markets beginning to emerge. We talked about biodiversity net gain, of course. We have the nutrient neutrality market developed by Hampshire and Isle of Wildlife Trust and then taken on by local planning authorities of voluntary carbon markets, which can be significant. Conservation credits, voluntary conservation credits, which don't really operate in the UK, but they are operating internationally. And there are other markets out there, for example, water companies paying organisations to improve the habitat conditions for easier to treat raw drinking water. So rather than burning the moors and polluting our waters, you might not burn the moors and fix the peat bogs as an example. But we are a very, very long way from that funding gap. Nevertheless, there's some pretty interesting schemes going on about then. A good example, and the one that we're involved in, the Wildlife Trust, is a donation by Aviva to the Wildlife Trust of £40 million, which I think is the largest ever corporate donation to an NGO for nature conservation. Might be wrong on that, in the UK anyway. And it's a pretty simple scheme. We're buying about 2,000 hectares of new nature reserve, planting trees on them. That extracts the carbon out of the atmosphere. We then turn that into woodland carbon code credits through that verification system and hand that over to Aviva to retire as part of their net zero strategy. Mm-hmm. So, and that sounds simple. Buying 2,000 hectares of land is actually really complicated, but and doing all the calculations, blah blah blah. But it's a £40 million. That's going some way towards that ambition. Small way, but some way towards that ambition. So it's good to see. Now, we spent quite a lot of time with Aviva when we started talking to them about developing that, because it's complicated, and the last thing that we want to be accused of in the Wildlife Trust is that we're part of the greenwashing. We've seen in the voluntary carbon market some pretty bad practice. We don't want to be part of that. We actually spent a whole year developing that contract, that legal contract, really making the case that the gains, the carbon gains, absolutely have to be real, i.e. they're genuinely reducing carbon out of the atmosphere permanently and sustained. It's not a temporary thing. It's not like growing a citrus fruit product, then you're going to then cut it down. We captured all of that thinking with others in this nature markets principle. So you can see these sort of delivery principles that we're developing in there, and we developed that with a whole bunch of other people. So that's really quite important. But I'm going to just pick up on two in relation to biodiversity net gain, which I think is really important. So firstly, it has to be additional. Okay, so it's a 10% gain in biodiversity. Now it's interesting, the voluntary carbon market world, we actually put a 20% buffer on, and we do this in nutrient neutrality as well, 20% buffer on, just to account for the issues around the metrics, because the metrics aren't perfect. They can't be perfect. We're dealing with a messy, chaotic systems. So it feels to me that 10% is probably just the margin of error. Now, it could work both ways, of course, so it might be well beyond the margin of error. It could be within the margin of error. So some people have said this is not really biodiversity net gain. Actually, Tony Juniper, as Chair of Natural Living, made this point. It's really biodiversity net neutrality is what we're really talking about. That's good, of course, because it's better than the current system. So it's good that we're getting there, but we're encouraging local planning authorities to look at 20% at least in order to make sure that it's absolutely about biodiversity net gain. But of course, it's up to the local planning authority. The other thing is that developments tend to be permanent. So why shouldn't the biodiversity net gain be permanent? So 30 years cannot be right to us. It absolutely doesn't work for us as Wildlife Trust. It has to be a permanent gain in biodiversity to offset that permanent loss of biodiversity. If we want to restore biodiversity in this country, it has to be permanent. So these are issues that we're trying to grapple with, and And we can obviously advocate for those sorts of approaches to government, to local planning authorities, to responsible developers and so on, but we can also advocate it to ourselves. So our role at the Central Charity of the Wildlife Trust is to continue to advocate for a better biodiversity net gain regulations, make the markets more effective, because there are issues around verification and monitoring and so on, and the lack of local planning authority ecologists and things like that. Provide guidelines to ourselves actually so that we can operate to our own higher standards maybe. Provide advice. We've written I think we've got a 75-page biodiversity net gain handbook that we've just produced that we share around the partnership. Facilitate and support our wildlife trusts to deliver, and develop multi-wildlife trust offers to the marketplace so that bigger companies don't have to be dealing with lots and lots of different providers. They can deal with a central point, as it were. So this biodiversity net gain standard, we sort of aim to provide this so-called gold standard. That's probably a bit arrogant, but we really want to build in additionality and permanence guaranteed by our trusted brand as being a wildlife trust, and we know that our brand is very well trusted, and we want to have those biodiversity net gain sites integrated into the nature recovery network, because this is fundamental in the way that we restore wildlife across the country. And by creating new nature reserves as a result of those net gain sites, we confer all the co-benefits that you have of wildlife trust nature reserves. We've got volunteers on there and school kids going out there and kids picnic and their open access and etc., and crucially go beyond that 10% if we can. So far we've got 18 delivery sites in place. So these are our land banks, if you like, offering biodiversity net gain credits across England. We know that we've got probably another 30 to come on stream. So really, wherever you are in England, we should be able to provide biodiversity net gain credits relatively soon. And you can see the map there showing the distribution of those. And I'm just going to pick on 3, and it's a bit random, the ones that I've picked on. But let's just pick up these 3 just to give you an illustration of the sorts of approach that we're taking. So this one's called Wild Whittington. It's near Chesterfield, so it's in the Chesterfield Local Planning Authority. It's part of that strategic local nature recovery network in line with the local nature recovery strategy. So Derbyshire Wildlife Trust working alongside Chesterfield, or working alongside Derbyshire County Council in that particular case, in developing that local nature recovery strategy is really important. It connects through to local wildlife sites and is actually next to ancient woodlands. So you can see that approach that we're trying to take to develop these sites in strategic locations that creates that nature recovery network. It's really important to do that. And actually, the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust has taken an interesting approach in that they are intervening, so they're using the money, the revenues that they create, to intervene in the site to restore natural processes. So they don't have a massive particular outcome in place, but obviously those natural processes in that particular case, as former arable land, is likely to lead to grassland, mixed scrub and broadleaf woodland on what was once arable land, and they're already 2 years into it on that site. So really interesting changes happening in the landscape already. This one's for Cheshire Wildlife Trust, so this is in the Cheshire East Local Planning Authority. It's in the floodplain of the River Dane. That's one of the River Mersey tributaries. It was originally arable and heavily fertilised pasture, so now a particular wildlife interest. And here we're using traditional habitat management techniques of tree planting, meadow creation, and creating mixed scrub, meadows, broadleaf woodlands. It creates 47 biodiversity net gain units, and they've also stacked up on top of that some part of the site, so separate from the biodiversity net gain, another part of the site that's selling on voluntary carbon market, carbon credits, and then there's ponds, which again separated out again, but ponds which are part of Great Crested New District licensing scheme. So you've got 3 sort of green finance schemes being put together into a single site there. Part of the Cheshire East Nature Recovery Network, adjacent to a local wildlife site. So again, that's just picking up that point that it's really important to be part of the Nature Recovery Network there. And it's interesting because the River Dane is a very flashy, so it's coming off the Pennines, a very, very flashy catchment. So it's part of the co-benefits in here. So one of the co-benefits is natural flood management, reconnecting the river to the floodplain, creating a hydrologically much, much rougher surface, which is holding that water back and stops flooding downstream. And also because some of that water is now running through partly a wetland complex, that's reducing the pollution load in the River Dane. So moderately polluted river being cleaned up through a biodiversity net gain site. So that's a nice one. And then this one from Burke's Box and Oxon. I probably should hand over to the guy who actually does all this, but Matt. So this is South Oxfordshire, a local planning authority, and this is a lovely site because right next to it, a fabulous nature reserve called Chimney Meadows Nature Reserve. It's a national nature reserve. It's a big triple SI. It's one of BBOUT's largest sites. It's a really special site. And this site was bought to enable river meandering of the Duxford Old River. So you can see that in the picture there. And that's an allowing fish passage so it gets around that weir that you can see in the picture there. So it's allowing fish passage. So the site was bought for that project and not much and no money to restore the rest of the site. So using biodiversity net gain credits, the rest of the site can be restored into a wetland mosaic, including grassland and woodland. So these are very high distinctiveness habitats. So really, really nice site. And Matt can give you all the detail later on if you want any questions on that. So that's the sort of general approach that we're taking as Wildlife Trust. I just want to leave you with one last thought that for many farms in the UK, particularly on the marginal soils in the west and in the south and so on, that withdrawal of basic payment scheme is really a big problem for some farmers. Now, we could just abandon farming and, you know, from a nature conservation point of view, you could say, well, okay, great, well, you know, farming goes bust, nature comes in, all good. I don't think that's acceptable. A, we need food, of course we do, and B, we shouldn't do what we did to the coal industry or the steel industry. We should think about a just transition for our agricultural, you know, our friends in the farming community. So there's a wider importance here around green finance. So when we talk about voluntary carbon markets or biodiversity net gain or nutrient neutrality, these could be important revenue streams that allows farmers to go through that transition towards more sustainable land use with a lot more wildlife in it, of course, but actually in a way that generates prosperous farming in the future, because that's going to be important. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.